Good evening. I'm the Maven of the Eventide, and welcome to Vampire Reviews. Again, I feel like we were just together. So, if you are watching the new Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire TV show on AMC+, then you had the treat of seeing episode 2 a week ahead of everyone else, and you will also get the next 5 episodes all a week ahead of time from when they air on AMC's cable channel. So even though the show just launched, we're all ready to talk about episode 2 right now. If you're not, if you haven't watched it yet because you don't have AMC+, put a bookmark on this video and come back to me after October 9th, because as always, we are going to talk about many spoilers as we go through the episode point by point to analyze all of its vampire-y goodness, or whatever it may have to offer us. Episode 2, After the Phantoms of Your Former Self. The episode opens in Louis's penthouse with Daniel examining one of the paintings on his wall, a disturbing oil depiction of the suffering of Christ by ghouls, and the signature reads, Marius de Romanus. Daniel says he's never heard of him, but we sure have. Marius is one of the main vampires in the Chronicles, a 2,000-year-old ancient Roman who decided to become a painter during the Venetian Renaissance period. He's the vampire who made Armand and the mentor who told Lestat that he needed to go live a full regular life in the mortal world with companions he loved before he fully gave into detached vampiric existence. In the books, Lestat does that immediately, moving to New Orleans and finding Louis in 1791. But in the show, it apparently took him an extra century or so before he followed Marius's advice. The fact that Louis has one of Marius's paintings on his wall is either a wild coincidence, because in the books, Louis never learned Marius existed until after Lestat read his book and was inspired to write his own book, and neither of those books exist yet, or these shows changed events again, and now Louis has some past experience or even knowledge of Marius. Intriguing. When do we get to hear that story? I'm not sure if this is set up for some wild canon deviations or just supposed to be another random The Vampire Lestat Easter egg the showrunners are tossing to book fans. During Comic-Con, they told us to watch out for Easter eggs from the vampire Armand. But I wouldn't say that this one counts, because we already knew from The Vampire Lestat that Marius was a painter in Venice during the Renaissance. And after the name drop, he's never mentioned again. Louis's servant Rashid tells Daniel it's dinner time and that Louis will join him at course 7 to continue their interview. Daniel tries to get Rashid to elaborate on the nature of his relationship with Louis, if he's just a servant or perhaps something more. But all Rashid says is that Louis is a god and it is his honor to serve him. I'm sure Louis loves being thought of as a god. Does he encourage all his staff to think this? Such an opposite from how he is in the books, where he thinks his vampiric nature makes him beneath humanity and that humans are the supreme beings always. While Louis's giant staff serves Daniel a series of ridiculously gourmet dishes to show off how rich and fabulous Louis is, they cover Louis's side of the table with saran wrap and pour a hospital bag of blood into a bowl over a tea light to warm it. When Louis finally shows up, the first thing he says is that he wants to apologize for his outburst earlier and that it won't happen again. But I have no idea what he's talking about. Did he have an outburst in episode 1 that I missed? The closest thing I can think of was when he called Daniel disrespectful before their interview even started, but why would he be apologizing for that now? And then Daniel responds by saying that memory is a monster, so it seems like the outburst was supposed to be about something Louis was remembering in his story and got upset about it, but episode 1 ended with Louis quietly whispering about his memories of being made a vampire. Was there supposed to be a scene after that where he had an outburst and it, got cut or something? I'm so confused. Louis's staff serves him the bowl full of blood-like soup and say it's straight from the farm. Daniel says he wants to ask about the farm, but Louis cuts him off, and I'm like, wait, no, tell us about the farm. This is something actually interesting and new that I want details about. Vampires never get blood from farms in the books. Tell me. Louis jumps right back into his story after he and Lestat leave the church, and he is now a vampire. And After what was such a serious and moody and mysterious first episode, now the show has suddenly decided it's a comedy. I love dark humor in my vampires, and the books have always had their moments of fun, but the complete tonal shift between episode 1 and episode 2 is so sudden. Lestat is pushing a wheelbarrow with the dead priests through a graveyard, while Louis is lurching after him, puking his guts out as he goes through his vampire transformation. And Lestat is handling everything in such a glib way, offering Louis no comfort and shoving the bodies into a convenient grave with comedic sound effects of crunching bones. Lestat is just as dismissive of Louis' transformation in the book, which is something Louis resents him bitterly for from the start, but though he mentions being rushed through it here, he's not mad about it anymore. Louis hungrily goes after some spilled blood from the bodies, and Lestat stops him, telling him that he can only drink the blood of the living, that dead blood will suck you down into death. So this was a thing in the book, sure, but it was one of those things that Anne Rice retconned in the later books. In The Vampire Lestat, he drinks some dead blood as a very young fledgling vampire, and though it makes him feel a little bad, he's otherwise just fine. And it turns out it's no big deal after all. For the show to bring back this vampire rule and make a big point of establishing it makes me think that this is Chekhov's dead blood, and drinking dead blood will probably come into play in some climactic way later in the show. In the movie, the dead blood thing came back when Claudia famously tries to kill Lestat by tricking him into drinking from dead victims, but that wasn't in the book at all. The victim's blood was just poisoned here. So that the show seems to be going with a lore change based on the movie is a curious choice. Kind of like how they did with Lestat flying during his first feeding. We'll see where they go with this. Louis continues to writhe on the ground in agony until suddenly he's over it, and he's looking around at the night through his new vampire eyes, grinning like he's high, and when Lestat sees him, he's elated, and for a few minutes they are so completely happy together. Louis says that he feels like he can finally now receive the secrets of existence, and Daniel compares it to a drug trip, which is apt in that this high Louis feeling ends up being false. There are no secrets to existence, and his ultimate letdown with his vampire nature is a pretty epic crash. Lestat takes Louis on his first vampire hunt, telling him,
"They were your brothers and sisters once, but now they're your savory inferiors."
He also often calls humans the food or the meat. And here we have another big change from canon. In the books, what sets Lestat apart from other vampires who all live as nightmare ghouls is that he loves humanity, and he never sees them as inferiors. His love for humanity makes him a pariah among vampire kind, and they seek to punish him for it. But because of his just all-around awesomeness, he prevails in changing the outlook of vampires the world over to be reverential of human life, and his philosophy of being part of it in that he brings its end. He calls himself Gentleman Death, the ironic counterpoint to the gruesome horror of death figures that came before. And then, when he gets to know Louis, he is in awe of him because Louis is the one vampire whose love of mortals eclipses even Lestat's own. Both of them know that as vampires, they are monsters. They are evil in the sense that they understand evil, and they both always value good above evil and would never think of humans as inferiors. This is a huge shift in Lestat's life philosophy that will color the entire way his character develops through the course of the show. Louis sees a handsome sailor that he wants to make his first victim, but Lestat warns him the man is too conspicuous and people would be looking for him if he went missing. He instead directs Louis' attention to a salesman visiting from out of town, instructing him on the value of caution in their choice of who they kill. This man is much less attractive and tediously boring, and we get another comedic scene of the vampires tolerating him talking about his business until they can lure him home for Louis to try his first attack. At one point, Louis starts acting creepy because he's so hungry, and Lestat speaks to him in his head, telling him to be careful, and this threw me because in the books, as soon as a vampire makes a human into a fledgling, their minds are completely blocked to each other, and they can't read each other's thoughts or use any psychic powers on each other. And wow, Lestat being able to still talk to Louis in his head is really going to change their dynamic. Once they get the victim home to Lestat's townhouse, Louis has a bit of a learning curve, making some hilarious mistakes, but eventually gets his meal. Lestat cheerfully rolls up the body in a rug, mentioning that they'll need to find a more efficient way of disposing of corpses soon, but meanwhile, Louis has come down from his high and is absolutely horrified with what he's become now that he's killed someone. As he's freaking out over it, he throws Lestat against the wall with his new vampire strength and runs out the door, saying he needs to go home. But surprise! It's daylight, and Louis gets his first experience of what the sun does to a vampire. He's fine as he walks in the shadows, but once he steps into a sunbeam, he starts disintegrating into ashes, and in a fit of screaming, terrifies a poor milkman as he pours the milk all over himself to soothe his burns. Comedy! When he comes running back home to Lestat, all Lestat needs to do is throw a cloak over his head to rescue Louis from the sun. He carries Louis upstairs like a new bride over the threshold, and explains that how, despite the challenges of being a vampire, New Orleans, with its nightlife and easily picked off tourists, is the perfect place for vampires to live. Louis is hunched over in agony from his burns, and Lestat just casually strips naked and shows him his coffin. Louis is horrified by that too, but when Lestat invites him to bed down with him, Louis tells Daniel that this moment of awakening to his sexuality was an overture to becoming one with his vampire nature, aka a murderer. Daniel here now takes on the meta voice of the audience, calling out Louis on the problematic nature of equating his queerness with his monstrousness. And then, when Louis explains that he felt like equals with Lestat as they lay together in the coffin, Daniel gets in a jab about how they're a white master and a black student, but equals. Sure. Louis then calls Daniel out on the cheap tactic of using such provocation, and it's like, okay, I see what you're doing here. Writing Louis as a black man obviously changes the dynamic between him and Lestat. This was a huge note of concern among fans when the news came out last year, because in the book, Lestat literally calls Louis his slave, and Louis says he feels like his slave. There is a huge power imbalance in their relationship, but the show is supposed to be a love story. How is it going to make that believably romantic for an audience without getting completely torn apart by critics? Well, the critics can't call them out on it if they acknowledge it first in the show, right? Brilliant! See, they're self-aware, so that makes it okay. Anyone who criticizes it now is just a virtue-signaling woke scolder, and AMC can wash its hands of any sense of irresponsibility for the changes it made. And then, of course, these topics are basically immediately dropped and not addressed again now that they've checked that housekeeping off their list. What Louis actually says is,
in the quiet dark, we were equals.
And if you are thinking this phrasing sounds a little too flowery to not be pulled straight from Anne Rice, you'd be partially correct. The closest thing is a line in The Vampire Lestat where Lestat's ex-boyfriend Nicky says, "In the darkness, we are equals now." But there's nothing quiet about it. Nicky was using darkness as a negative term for evil. Now that they're both vampires, they've sunk to the same low. Here, the show has made it peaceful and cozy as they lie together in a safe coffin where Louis's horrible burns can slowly heal against Lestat's naked body. Them sharing a coffin on Louis's first day as a vampire is also straight out of the book and one of the things that got cut out of the movie because it was too gay. In the books, he's irrationally horrified of the coffin and disgusted to have to snuggle in there with Lestat, who he already hates. But this time they're in love, so even though he's charred to a crisp and feeling really horrible, he's happy to be in there. He still does end up getting his own coffin, though, after the first night. The show never explains why they need to sleep in coffins. In the book, it's because even the tiniest bit of reflected ray of sunlight can kill them, so they need the enclosed complete darkness. But here, they've gotten rid of the no daylight rule, so they have no reason for coffins, other than the aesthetic. Daniel and Louis's dinner together continues after Louis finishes eating his bowl of blood with a spoon, which, okay, couldn't just drink it out of a glass. Might have stayed much warmer in like a coffee mug or tumbler, just saying. The staff serves him a tied-up fox on a silver-covered platter. Daniel tries to bring the conversation back to Louis's horror at drinking and killing the salesman, and Louis gets in another sick burn about how he's sure Daniel never contemplates the life of the animals he eats. And then he takes an emphatic bite out of the throat of his little fox, splurting blood everywhere. This is why they put down saran wrap. You'd think after a century he'd be better at catching the blood in his mouth, but hey. Louis then gives Daniel a speech straight from the book about how vampires are killers, whose all-seeing eyes are meant to give them detachment and able to see human life in its entirety with the thrilling satisfaction of being the end of that life, having a hand in the divine plan. And again, this chunk of Anne Rice's prose sounds so at odds with the rest of the dialogue in the scene that it's like Louis is suddenly quoting Shakespeare. Actually, he's quoting Lestat because in the book, that's Lestat's line when he's trying to convince Louis to accept his vampire nature, and Louis never buys into it. But this Louis in the show is so on board with being a killer now that he's quoting Lestat word for word to convince Daniel. And then Daniel, hard-hitting, aggressive journalist that he is, just calls bullshit, saying readers won't buy it. And then, here, Louis gives another reason for why he wants to do this interview, saying that that's the point, that their book must be a warning to readers. Warning them about what, though? Mysterious. Back to Louis' story, he talks about how he was reluctant to kill at first, and Lestat promises him it'll get easier, and then he asks Lestat to teach him how to use his vampire powers to read minds. And Lestat does. Another big change. In the book, though Lestat can read minds, this is a power he keeps secret from Louis their whole life together. Louis is a much weaker vampire and doesn't have this power, and his disconnection from the minds of mortals shapes his vampire existence in significant ways. Because Louis immediately hated his vampire existence so much, Lestat always kept his superpowers secret from Louis so that Louis wouldn't think he was even more monstrous and hate Lestat more as well. Louis was repulsed by all his powers, never wanting to explore them or indulge in anything that made him feel less human. But here, he's excited to learn how to read minds, and he's now powerful enough to be a natural at it. So he is still repulsed by killing, but all the other parts of being an inhuman supernatural being, he thinks are pretty cool. When he asks Lestat to read his mind, Lestat tells him that he can't, because he's his fledgling and their minds are now blocked to each other. Wait. What about that scene earlier where he totally did it? Okay. So I guess we are going back to that rule from canon. Lestat calls this loss of mental connection a sacrifice and says that they'll have to rely on each other's discretion to communicate. And when Louis compares that to how humans have to do it, Lestat reminds him that he's not one of them anymore. And then we get our episode title drop, and he tells Louis he chases after phantoms of his former self and cheerfully proclaims that he will break him of it. Such a difference from how that line is delivered in the book, which is during an extremely tense and climactic scene that is a huge turning point in their relationship after everything has gone horribly bad between them for years, and Louis is on the verge of dumping Lestat and running away, so Lestat has to teach him some hard lessons. There is actually a reworked version of this particular scene later in this episode, but at this point right now, there's still a happy new couple frolicking through New Orleans, enjoying their cool new vampire powers. But despite Lestat's advice to separate himself from humanity and fully embrace vampire life, Louis insists on maintaining ties with his mortal family and business, and a couple months later, he takes Lestat to a party at his family's house. As they are walking there, Lestat mentions that they are going to the theater later, and the play that they're going to see is A Doll's House by Henrik Ibsen, which is famous among queer theorists for its lesbian subtexts. It is a story about a woman struggling with her identity, and the play ends with her making the ultimate assertion of her agency and independence by walking out on her husband and her children in order to truly understand herself and learn about the world. And this is parallel to what Lestat wants Louis to do with his own life. Leave his family and other human ties behind, his closeted, straight, mortal life he was living, and truly embrace and explore the world that opens up with his new gay vampire existence. Yeah, keep wishing, Lestat. Louis's gonna take a while to get there. Really, really long while. At the party, Louis's mom is cold to both of them, and Louis hears her thinking disparaging things about her suspicions that they're gay. Disappointed, Louis looks for his sister, and she's overjoyed to see him. She notices things different about him, like the way his eyes changed, which he's been hiding behind sunglasses, but she says the new him is better. Finally, someone encouraging him on his gay journey. He uses his vampire super senses and hears that she has 3 heartbeats, which means she's pregnant with twins, and this moment of connection makes him all the more determined to cling to his family and pass mortal life. Meanwhile, he is also still working with the white businessman from the first episode to open up the new brothel, but while the white lawyer is treating him in such a condescending way, Louis has a moment of revelation that he hates how his whole life he's had to put up with being treated like it's some kind of miracle that he's smart and good at his job because such a thing is so unexpected for a black man. And now he doesn't have to put up with it anymore. He attacks the lawyer, feeding from him, for once really embracing his vampire nature as a killer and liking it. But unfortunately, this isn't exactly what Lestat had in mind because the lawyer was too suspicious of a victim, and Lestat berates Louis for his recklessness, leading to a fight between them. Aw, their first marital spat. That Louis attacks the lawyer while he's peeing might be a nod to the first victim he ever takes in the book, which is a runaway slave who leaves his friends to go pee in the woods, even though this scene is far from his first kill. We also get to see here that Louis and Lestat have come up with a solution to their body disposal problem. They now have a handy-dandy incinerator right in the backyard of their townhouse. While they are dumping the body in it to burn, Louis argues that as a white, straight-passing European, Lestat can't understand all the rage that he has as a black queer man in America that was bound to explode now that he has super vampire powers. And when Lestat calls Louis fledgling, Louis demands he stop it because fledgling sounds too much like slave. Once again, making a point to prove to the audience that the show is self-aware, really, about all these issues that might be found problematic. It knows exactly how bad it looks. So therefore, that makes it okay. But this fight is extremely short-lived. Lestat says he doesn't like to go to bed angry and asks how he can make it up to Louis. And Louis, still riding the high on his power trip, says he wants to buy Tom Anderson's saloon, the whites-only brothel from the first episode where Lily used to work, and remake it into an integrated establishment to elevate the black population. Even though Lestat still doesn't approve of Louis continuing to be involved in mortal business, he loans Louis the money, which Louis pays back every cent on a point of pride, and Louis becomes the new owner of the Azalea nightclub. A win for black pimps everywhere! One notable thing about the scene where Lestat agrees to help Louis buy the saloon, he says, "How can I say no to you?" This is a reference to the times in the books Lestat says that he can never deny Louis anything. And I love that the show kept this tidbit of their relationship dynamic because as much as Lestat is the more powerful one, is the leader, the master, the one always in control, he really is completely lost for Louis when it comes down to it. And him feeling unable to deny Louis anything develops significant layers along the way. Although the white businessmen think Louis is overreaching his station, Louis says owning the fanciest saloon in Storyville is everything he's ever wanted or wished for. He's finally broken through the glass ceiling and achieved the success and stature that makes him feel fulfilled. It's notable that Louis focuses so much on his career as the mark of his happiness, saying nothing similar about his romantic life, because Lestat's outlook is entirely the opposite. Lestat thinks that career success is meaningless, and for him, achieving love and companionship is what makes him happiest. But for 5 good years, they both have what they want. Even though Louis never actually says he loves Lestat or tells Daniel that he's enjoying his vampire marriage, Lestat at least has him as a companion, and they are living together comfortably and contentedly, Louis now seeming to be over his aversion to killing after his revelation of empowerment when he killed the lawyer. This is very different from how the beginning of their relationship goes in canon. In the book, their life together is horrible and filled with strife right from the start. Louis decides he hates Lestat as soon as he becomes a vampire, and for 3 years they live in tense hostility before Lestat finally teaches Louis that big turning point lesson I mentioned earlier. But the show here has now brought us up to 1917, and they are a happy and healthy couple of murder husbands living the high life in New Orleans jazz age and making a mountain of money. Louis tells us, though, that while he was enjoying all this business success, he neglected his family, and then guiltily goes to visit his sister, who is upset by how absent he's been over the years. He uses the excuse of his situation for why it's been hard for him to visit, by which he means that he's gay, which his sister knows but never says aloud. She awkwardly changes the subject and has him hold her new baby while she goes to get him some gumbo and tend to her now 6-year-old twins. While Louis is alone with the baby, his bloodlust starts to take over, and he becomes horrified by his desire to drink the baby's blood. But before we find out what happens, he cuts off his story to tell Daniel that he no longer kills humans, and he hasn't killed a single human in over 20 years now, and that's really important to him, that the readers of this book they're going to make out of his interview understand that about him. He has mastered his bloodlust. Daniel asks about the other vampires out there in the world, and Louis says that they are the opposite, slaves to the blood, and that now in this modern age, they are all tired of hiding from the world and want to increase their numbers. That's ominous. Vampires wanting to come out of hiding is the exact opposite of how they are in the books. The vampires in canon are all furious at Louis for revealing their existence with his interview, and then later at Lestat as well for telling the world vampires exist. But now they're wanting to increase their numbers, and Louis says that the pandemic and state of the world's politics in 2022 is the opening the vampires have been waiting for. But to do what? Take over the world? He says the plotting, evil, brutish vampires out there are calling it the Great Conversion. And somehow, Louis releasing his interview now is going to help stop them, and that's why he called Daniel back again to tell his story right this time. Daniel tries to call bullshit, saying humans won't want to become vampires and join the Great Conversion, but Louis calls bullshit right back, saying tons of people would want eternal life. Meanwhile, Daniel keeps asking Louis over and over again if he ate his sister's baby. Well, the staff brings Louis his next dinner course, which is a human blood donor who sits next to him so Louis can bite his neck and take the little drink. Apparently, he's somehow gained the power and control to be able to do this now, even though he never did in the book by this point. In the books, it took Louis getting an infusion of extremely powerful blood from Lestat centuries later, who had recently also gained extremely powerful blood from an ancient vampire before Louis, previously one of the weakest and most human of all vampires, was strong enough to drink without killing or read minds or any of those other things. But here in the show, it seems Louis just develops these powers on his own as he got older, making his vampire strength and growth come from his internal fortitude instead of outside influences. Once again, developing a very different twist on his character and the nature and symbolic meaning of vampires in general. The episode's tone of absurdist comedy continues as Louis's blood donor makes chit-chat with Daniel while Louis is sucking on his neck and Daniel struggles to eat his own dinner. The story cuts back to the tense moment of Louis with the baby, making us fear he ate his own nephew, but then reveals he only ran home to cry about it to Lestat, horrified with his lack of control over his bloodlust. Another nice canon detail here is that Louis's tears are made of blood, just like in the books. As Lestat comforts him, he says he knows Louis has been skipping meals lately, revealing that he's not quite made peace with killing as we thought. Lestat tries once again to convince him to give up his mortal family for their own good as well as his, and Louis laments how he'll never have a family of his own. This hurts Lestat's feelings, and he tells Louis that he's his family. But Louis just wallows in his self-pity, telling Lestat he should find someone new. Lestat tells him once more how much he loves him, and then finally manages to cheer Louis up by distracting him with plans to go out on a date night to the opera and try to rekindle their romance that's been a bit neglected lately. Louis says 3 times in a row to Daniel that Lestat had a way about him, that he was just so charming that Louis couldn't help being drawn to him. The fact that he has to say it 3 times in this episode gets to be a bit overcompensating. It's like the show didn't trust the audience to find the actor playing Lestat charming enough naturally, or the actions of the scenes to show it and its effects. So the script has to tell us how extremely charming Lestat is, just to make sure we understand. Lestat's charming, okay? And now anyone in the audience who's wondering why the hell Louis puts up with this asshole can't say anything because we've told you 3 times now that he just has a way about him, okay? Accept it. Was this really necessary? Actor Sam Reed is doing a great job of selling it on his own. In fact, Louis tells Daniel that Lestat was preternaturally charming, which is okay. Maybe this is meant to be an Easter egg because there's a long-running fandom joke about Anne Rice's frequent use of the word preternatural. It's an uncommon word, so readers latch onto it as an amusing example of her famously flowery, purple, sensuous, florid, lush, humid prose style. And maybe the script tossed it in here to be cute, but applying it to Lestat's very natural charm is an odd choice. Preternatural is just another word for supernatural. But the difference is that supernatural specifically means that the magic power is derived from God or some other religious origin. Preternatural is the secular version of the word, and obviously Anne chose it as the more accurate description for what her vampires really are. They are not supernatural because God and the devil are no part of the magic that makes their undead powers. So preternatural is simply technically the correct term. And of course, she used it a lot when describing their powers and inhumanness, and people notice because it's a distracting word. There are charts out there measuring how many times she uses it in each book, but just saying, if she had used supernatural instead of all those times, no one would have batted an eye. Another neat tidbit about this moment, Lestat tells us that he was friends with Don Zanetti when he was writing the opera Don Pasquale, which is what they're going to see, and he saw its premiere, which was in 1843, which provides us one of our first clues of what he was up to in his extra 100 years of life the show has granted him before he met Louis. We still don't know if he slept through any of those years, but he was at least awake and kicking it with opera composers in Vienna in the 1840s. I am hoping this show keeps dropping bits like this until we can gradually fill in the complete timeline of Lestat's new missing years. Louis tells Daniel that Lestat didn't choose him to be a doormat, and Lestat liked it when Louis fought back. And this is true to the original. Lestat always admired Louis's fire and inner strength, chose him for the anger and darkness within him, and that's why it was such a surprise to Lestat when Louis turned out to be such a reluctant vampire who rebelled against him. And here, Louis tells Daniel that there was a worship on his part for Lestat, which, yes, great, that is also accurate to the books. But instead of him telling this to Daniel across the dinner table, I would have loved to see some of that dynamic also enacted in the scenes. Louis's reactions to Lestat in this episode do not come off as worshipful. Just like the beginning of their romance, Lestat is still often gazing at Louis adoringly with hearts in his eyes, but we just don't see Louis reciprocating this kind of visible love as he's so caught up in his own head over his own life struggles. Like, for instance, in the very next scene on their date night to the opera, Louis is seething with frustration and resentment for the way he has to pretend to be Lestat's servant to get away with attending the opera as a black man during Jim Crow. He is not feeling any lovey or worshipy feelings here. He tells us that Lestat disarms him of his seething anger when Lestat makes a very romantic and vulnerable confession about how his greatest fear is the curse of loneliness in his vampire existence, and that Louis is the one that takes this horrible feeling away from him, and that they must never part. But instead of responding with any kind of love or affection or vulnerability or reassurances of his own, Louis redirects the subject and asks Lestat how many vampires there are in the world. What Louis is telling Daniel about his feelings for Lestat just isn't showing up in the scenes of them together at all. They've been a couple for 7 years now, and as far as we know, Louis never even once said, "I love you," back to Lestat. He just gives Lestat these pensive stares. The best we get is a little smile as he goes on to tell us that Lestat's obsession with music, leading him to separate musically talented humans from food, moved Louis to see that even Lestat had some human attachments. Moved. You're not totally creepy and inhuman, I guess. That's great. Yeah, put that on a Hallmark card. If the whole journey of Louis becoming a vampire, as built up at the end of the first episode, was to shed all the constraints of his mortal existence, all the toxic masculinity he had to cling to be seen as tough and get respect in his society as a black man, and to embrace his sensitive side and allow himself to have real romance and freedom of expression, he's not doing a very good job at it. So is becoming a vampire really meant anything for him at all in the end? They're both soon distracted from all this as Lestat gets pissed off by how horrible one of the singers in the opera is and targets him as a victim after the show is over. Louis describes the situation in words dripping with judgmental disgust over Lestat's hunting tactics, which seems to come out of nowhere when he's never complained before about the way Lestat treats victims. In the book, this strain between them was built up much more solidly over time, of Louis witnessing many examples of the sadistic way Lestat kills people that offends his sensibilities. But the show goes straight from them seeming to have been in a settled understanding for years to Louis suddenly having a problem with it. The reason it feels so forced here is because this is finally the scene from the book I mentioned earlier, where Lestat decided to teach Louis a lesson about accepting his vampire nature. And it's such a huge scene in the book, I guess the show felt that it needed to have its equivalent, but it just doesn't fit here because Louis already well accepted his vampire nature for years now. Lestat's offhanded mention earlier of him skipping meals was so minimal and not elaborated on that there's no setup for there needing to be a lesson taught here. It's just a random encounter that Louis has decided this time he has a problem with. In the book, Lestat sets the stage and plays the scene out with two sex workers, toying with them torturously in a way that repulses Louis before finally convincing Louis to kill one, ending Louis's years of feeding on animals only. In the show, the scene is done with the opera singer, who Lestat first humiliates by pointing out all his singing mistakes before slicing his vocal cords so he can never sing again. And when Louis makes a judgmental comment about the cruelty, Lestat goes from 0 to 11, suddenly screaming at Louis the same dialogue from the book about how Louis doesn't have to enjoy killing, but he needs to do it and embrace what he is, and just it makes no sense because Louis hasn't even started living off animals yet. He was just kind of sad about bloodlusting over his sister's baby. But since there's no lesson needing to be taught this time, I guess this explosion of Lestat's temper just comes from how hurt he is that Louis is judging him, and Louis' general disgust with the way Lestat chooses to be a vampire is true to form. In the book, Louis considered himself Lestat's superior in all ways, a much better vampire than Lestat could ever be because Louis saw the beauty and dignity in death and the life he took and the world around them. But since the show has incorporated the more fleshed out version of Lestat's character and established that he's not the shallow idiot Louis painted him to be in the book, that sense of superiority doesn't come across, and their conflict in this scene is just very muddled. Louis outright tells Daniel that he was in denial, and that as a vampire, Lestat was an artist. Lestat makes his speech from the book, telling Louis that if he finally submits to his nature, he will be filled with all the life he can hold and see death in all its beauty. But Louis has been submitting to his nature for years now, so of course he gives in and joins Lestat to drink the singer's blood. But he says that though Lestat was completely enthralled, he was only pretending, afraid to disappoint him. And then Louis tells Daniel that he never actually learned to savor killing and calls himself a fumbling, botched vampire. Okay. I didn't see any evidence of that in like 90% of this episode, but sure, we had to get there eventually, I guess. When you're filling up 7 episodes of a season, sometimes you have to go around in circles. The episode ends with Louis' staff serving both him and Daniel an ice cream dessert. And Louis says he tries to eat human food once a week to maintain the thread, but that it tastes like soap to him and he doesn't like it at all. In the books, this isn't something vampires can do at all. They can't consume anything at all besides blood. But here, he's maintaining the thread because food is the way to do that. Meanwhile, Daniel bittersweetly reminisces about his first wife. And the last shot of the episode slowly pans out on both of them, looking sad and lonely at opposite ends of this vast dinner table between them, while sorrowful music plays, and our attention is drawn to the two artworks on Louis's wall. One is a 17th century Rembrandt painting, and this might be a nod to the way Rembrandt is revered in the fourth book of the Chronicles, though that was Lestat's obsession, not Louis's. Louis is much more of a Monet fan. The other is a modern piece done by current New Orleans artist Ron Bachet. The modern, beside the classic, the new and the old, the two ends of Louis's long, sad existence, as both Louis and Daniel mournfully contemplate the forlornness their lives have come to, and the screen fades to black. Quite a turnaround from the optimistic end of the first episode, where the notion of the vampire promised Louis a future of hope and possibility and freedom. Through the course of this episode, the vampire for him transitioned from a power fantasy, where he could gain everything he ever wished for, to despair and disillusionment. He was blinded by the allure of career and societal success he thought he wanted, and in doing so, lost touch with what seemed more important, his family. But beneath all that, throughout it all, he takes for granted the love Lestat is offering him, or is too repulsed by their shared monstrous nature to let himself accept it. Which portends that Louis may soon end up with nothing at all if he doesn't find a way to turn things around and figure out what being a vampire actually does mean for him. How will he do that? We'll find out next Sunday when episode 3 airs on AMC+. So many more things that I feel like I could have also said about this episode. Picking and choosing what to talk about in these videos is a struggle, because I could really go on. I know there are things that I didn't even address, so if you have thoughts and feelings, please share them in the comments and we can talk further. And if you would like to see my next episode ahead of time before I make it public, you can join my Patreon and you can see my video on episode 3 early. I hope you have a wonderful October-y week. Until next time.